Hello everyone, this is NPC's Economics. In this video, we'll talk about why the United States has soft-locked itself into a fertility doom loop and what that means in the long run. Replacement level fertility, the number of children born per woman, needs to be around 2.1 births in order for a country's population to hold steady. In a country with declining fertility rates like Japan, the median age of the population would rise over time. Fewer young people will be available to work, and there will be more retirees. This places an increasing level burden on the working age population, as fewer people will be paying into social programs, while more people will be using these social programs. As the working age population shrinks, it also acts as a drag on productivity and economic growth. Such a country will generate wealth at a slower rate than before and grows poorer over time, and more on productivity later. As the standard of living decreases due to a decline in economic and productivity growth, people are discouraged from having children. And as people are discouraged from having children, it further accelerates the aging population, strains on social programs, and productivity drags it even further down. This is known as the doom loop of a falling fertility rate. It is not just Japan. Other industrialized and advanced countries, including the United States, are also staring at the same long-term decline. As recently as the mid-2000s, the United States was bucking the trend of many peer nations in Europe and Asia, with an average of a 2.1 fertility rate. But that quickly plummeted during the Great Recession. And even after the recession ended, it has still been on a continuously downward trend. This persisted even throughout the so-called longest economic expansion in the US history, from 2009 to 2020. Although the fertility rate rebounded a bit in 2021, some argue that it was simply due to the sharper drop in 2020 from the cerveza thickness. Compared to 2007, the birth rate is over 20% lower today. Sure, some of the factors are well known and apply globally, from increased urbanization, where children, instead of being free or cheap labor in agrarian societies, they are now expensive furnitures in cities, to increased educational attainment of women, where children now become more expensive opportunity cost. But these explanations don't account for the whole picture in the United States. If the US just had the longest economic expansions ever, if things are so great, then what gives? I'm going to postulate a few reasons. First, people of reproductive age are not the ones who are benefiting from productivity growth. Remember I said earlier that an increase in productivity means higher living standards and vice versa? But what if the distribution of such productivity gain is so lopsided that most people don't benefit from it anyway? You might have seen this chart before. This is the worker compensation versus productivity growth by the Economic Policy Institute. The obvious thing here is that workers' compensation has failed to keep up with productivity for the last half a century in the US. The EPI postulates that policy choices made to suppress wage growth, such as excessive unemployment tolerated to keep any chance of inflation in check, smaller and rarer raises in the federal minimum wage, growing employer hostility towards unions, and anti-worker deregulatory pushes, such as the deregulation of the trucking and airline industries, as well as the retreat of antitrust policy to the dismantling of financial regulations. As a result, potential pay growth fueled by rising productivity failed to translate into actual pay growth for most workers. So then, where has all the productivity gone? The answer is fairly simple. The bulk of that productivity gain has gone to top earners and capital assets owners. New technology like computers is more empowering for those who are already well paid, the high skilled workers. This means well paid workers have increasing wages, while lower paid workers, especially in manual labor, have stagnant wages. I should note some caveats of the EPI graph here. The EPI defines typical workers' compensation as that of production and non-supervisory workers, which make up 80% of a US workforce over the entire period shown. What this means is workers' compensation here excludes the top 20% earners. Here is another EPI graph from its Pay and Productivity Gap series, which tracks real median hourly compensation, real average or mean hourly compensation, and net productivity. You can see the increasing gap between median and average mean compensations. If anything, this highlights wage inequality driven by technology-based skills gap among workers. But this video is not about the pay and productivity gap. And despite these caveats, the main point still stands. The majority of the workers have become relatively worse off over the period. As for capital assets, a popular narrative everyone has heard of probably is how CEO compensation has skyrocketed during the same period. Since company stocks make up a large chunk of CEO compensation, putting one plus one together leads to a conclusion that productivity gain has gone to the shareholders. From 1978 to 2018, when adjusted for inflation, the S&P 500 index went from 340 to 2,746, or an over 700% increase. Inflation-adjusted worker compensation definitely did not go up nowhere nearly this much. My point is that people of prime reproductive age are mostly entry-level to mid-career workers. They are not the ones who own the majority of the stocks in the stock market, nor are they likely to be part of the 20% top earning workers by definition. And contrary to what the elites think, the working class is not stupid. We can see that the workers have been told to work harder and harder, but only for our bosses to become wealthier and wealthier. We can see that the middle class is being hollowed out, the rich getting richer, and the poor get poorer. And what do you think happens when the majority of these workers are getting squeezed more and more? Well, something has to give. And in this case, the actual number of children one ends up with is lower than the desired number of children that they want. I don't need to go into details about this. Gallup and Pew Research have done many polls and surveys on this topic already. For example, when Gallup asked why couples are not having more kids, most Americans, 65% in 2013, whether with or without children, cited that the cost associated with raising a child as the reason. An additional 11% said it is because of the state of the economy and the jobs. Second, the cost of raising children has become astronomically more expensive. The USDA publishes figures on the average cost to raise a child from 0 to age 17 in the US. In 2023, that would be just a bit over $300,000. And that does not include college tuition. And also, given that an increasing number of young adults are still living at home with their parents, that represents additional expenses not accounted for in the USDA figure. A lot of parents would argue that they don't spend nearly as much raising their kids. While that may be true, the figure quoted is the average, which means while many are spending less than that, many are also spending more than that to raise a child. Childcare costs have also become expensive, especially in major cities. This is the recently published average annual prices for in-home infant care, In major cities, that often exceeds $40,000 per infant per year. That's a full time entry level salary here. While some may argue that a parent should simply stay home in order to save on childcare costs, both ways, whether it be a parent quitting his or her job to raise kids at home or outsource that to daycare centers, mean that the family would be relying on just one income, as the income of the other parent is basically eaten up by childcare costs. And that's a lot of purchasing power lost compared to a dual income no kids family. Again, the young people today are not stupid. They know that kids are expensive, and so many are delaying parenthood, hoping to become financially more secure first. Indeed, a look at the CDC's national vital statistics on births and natality shows a clear trend of rising age of mothers at birth. The fastest rising group is mothers ages 40 to 44, followed by ages 35 to 39. Meanwhile, the number of births to mothers aged under 25 has been declining. All this means is that people are waiting longer to have kids. But what this chart does not show, but does end up happening, is that many people overestimate their capacity to have children at older ages, and as a consequence, unintended childlessness has become more common. Third, the internet and the rise of social media have made more people realize that there are other paths in life than parenthood. Imagine in the pre internet world, let's say the 1980s, you are a child growing up in a typical middle class suburban neighborhood in the United States. Around you, you see your parents, your aunts and uncles, and your cousins, your friends and their parents. People mostly led similar lives, living in the suburb with a typical nuclear family structure of dad, mom, and the children, and everyone else doing the same. But today, with the internet, people can see on social media that there are many different people leading different lives. They also see forums and groups of regretful parents, such as this and this. Even mainstream media is hopping on that bandwagon, like that Time magazine cover from 2013, for example. But my point is, the internet has, in some sense, broadened people's perspectives. They see people doing things differently, leading lives differently, and so on. Some might question what they have seen or told growing up, and coupled with what I made during the first and second points, these people might opt out and opt for a different path than their parents or relatives or friends altogether. Perhaps the internet has also helped more young Americans realize how badly they have it compared to other countries. The United States is the only developed country without a federally mandated paid leave. Sure, some companies do offer paid leave, but those who benefit from them are typically well paid, skilled workers, the top 20%, not low income workers who would need it the most. These young Americans are also realizing that high student loan and consumer debts are also almost a uniquely American thing. They probably also realize that the push for a nuclear family model from the last few decades means, unlike other countries, there are no villages to help ease the burden of parenthood. It is no wonder they're questioning, why bother with all of this? Did I also mention that it is not uncommon to hear that some lament they cannot have kids because they have too much student loans, they have too much debt, or their jobs don't pay enough? As I said, fertility decline is not unique to the United States. In fact, other developed countries with often more generous social safety nets and pronatalist incentives are having it worse. Recently, LinkedIn published 34 ideas that will change our world in 2024. One of these ideas is that fertility gimmicks will fade and nations will have to get real about population decline. Critics argue that these incentives are falling flat because they fail to address what is really keeping people from having children. If you aren't affluent, it is extremely hard to make a decent living and start a family, and there are few signs it is going to get much easier. Perhaps the message people are receiving is that the governments are freaking out over lower birth rates, but apparently not freaking out enough to truly address the core issues. Some might see their peers sandwiched in the middle, on one hand taking care of their aging parents, and on the other hand taking care of their children, all while working at jobs that they hate but cannot quit, and they don't want to go down the same path. And at the more extreme and cynical end, some people might even ask, why should I make more future wage slaves so the rich can profit off of? To summarize, we should expect long-term declines in the United States due to rising income inequality and cost of living. The rising cost of raising children is another issue that we see the US government simply taking little interest in addressing. Government policies have favored the select few at the expense of many. While skilled workers are probably better off, most get stagnating wages that fail to keep up with productivity gain. Despite ever rising productivity, the rich continue to ingest a larger and larger share of the pie, and that money inflates paper assets and real estates, but puts little back into the real economy. So, what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you next week. Bye!